Hey guys, this is Infinite Flesh here. I'm going to be talking about, starting a Knight F3 kind of repertoire, opening repertoire, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of my thoughts on the opening, my experiences about, I've been playing this opening for the past 4 or 5 years, and I just want to, share, my thoughts with you guys about the opening entirely. Maybe become more interested in it after these kind of videos. I'll be continuing my Schliemann Rui Lopez repertoire at a later time, but I feel like I want to talk about an opening that hasn't received much attention on YouTube, and I feel like this will pique some interest from you guys. Now, against Knight F3, you may be wondering, it doesn't really put a pawn in the center, put a pawn in the center forward, but the thing about Knight F3 is, whenever you play openings, a lot of the time Knight F3 is anyways played in this kind of positions. But, you haven't committed to a pawn move just yet. So there are a lot of openings in which it's really helpful not to have played a move such as d4. And today I think I'm going to be talking about, a pretty serious and drastic example of an opening that's completely different from a d4 opening, by the way, with Knight F3 already inserted. Now, I'll give you one example if you're interested in wondering, what benefits does it give, say, over a move such as d4. Well, if you start off with d4, black can play a Grunfeld defense. You know what I'm talking about. This fianchetto move with, an early d5. The problem with this kind of position is white's already committed to this d4 move. If you can imagine it, if this pawn was back on this square, you haven't committed to d4, and, there is not this much pressure on the pawn that black always gets in the Grunfeld on it in a later time. And if you kind of think about this from a different perspective, if white and black play the same moves, except white doesn't play d4 immediately, you can go for these anti-Grunfeld setups with queen b3, queen a3, takes on d5 first maybe, and then those kind of moves. All three of them are very playable, and even takes and e4 going for this king in the middle game kind of position. But there's a lot of theory. There's a lot of ways to divert there without committing to d4 so early. And I guess what I can say is that's just one example of how Knight F3 is considered in one way, in one opening, slightly preferable over a move such as the queen's pawn opening with d4. Now, d4 has also advantages that Knight F3 doesn't, but for the purposes of these videos, I'm just showing you, the advantages that white has in the kind of Knight F3 videos. And today I'm going to be talking about the move d5 against Knight F3. This is a move that I've come across a lot in practice. Black plays this move that takes some space in the center, and kind of influence his position, trying to build his pieces off this pawn, because it's just kind of sitting there, and it kind of feels nice for black if he can maintain this kind of pawn and be solid. Now against this move, white can always play d4, but I'm not a big fan of entering the d4 complex after you've played Knight F3. Sure, there are there's purposes for this move order to play Knight F3 so early, but if you're going to play Knight F3, I would really suggest that you play another pawn move that takes part in the center. And when you think about it, my mouse is not working right now. Oh my god. I'm sorry guys, my mouse is not working. Another move like such as c4 in this position. Taking part in the center, putting some pressure on the pawn, and it kind of looks weird at first, but there's a reason that if you started c4, I don't think you'll be able to get white-black to play d5 so early. So in a way, this is kind of a unique opening on its own entirely. So I guess that I can talk about is the main moves that black has, and even the sidelines here. I mean, black usually wants to support the center somehow, or he has to react to the pawn. If this pawn's not defended or somehow moved, it's going to be taken, and black is going to be forfeiting the center, such as with the move, with knight f6, takes pawn, and I don't know, regardless with whatever piece that black captures with, white can play knight c3 or e4, gaining a tempo on the piece that comes to d5, and black is forfeiting the center, and white has really, really nice pieces here. This kind of structure isn't recommendable. The same thing goes for knight c6 and this kind of position with knight c3, and the same stuff goes for that kind of opening. And black has a lot of variations he can play against knight f3, but I'm going to be mostly focusing on d5, c4, and today is the first move I'm going to be talking about. There's a lot of interesting variations, and one of them is c6, with black already trying to be really solid and support his center. That's just one move for black. Another move is e6, which often transposes with the knight f6 queen's gambit complexes, and you can often get a Catalan or a Reti, without committing to d4 so early. This is also very interesting. Black can also not really support, but let's say kind of resolve this tension in the center with a move such as d4 or d takes c4. And today I think I'm going to be talking about one of those moves, probably even both, if I have enough time, but I think I'm going to be talking about this d4 move in this position. And this is really what we say the Reti advanced variation, where black takes and puts his pawn right over here and takes a lot of space here. I mean, you can't really develop your knight here anymore. So what you've got to do is kind of put the question to black is, what are you going to do about this pawn? And I think there are three moves in this position that white normally plays, and one of them is b4, kind of playing this flank, kind of Benoni kind of structure. Another one is g3, and this is also kind of a Benoni, exactly, but just a tempo up. That's pretty interesting for white, actually. But the move that I've been playing for about the past 4 years, that I've grown to have so much experience with, is this e3 move. Attacking the pawn and forcing black to resolve the tension in the center, or solidify it. And if black doesn't really want to play a move like d takes e3, allowing white to take with the f pawn and play d4 and build this really nice center, that's not ideal. I think a move such as c5 and knight c6 are definitely the two most logical options in this kind of position, and definitely they're most played because of that, because they support the pawn. If white plays a move like knight takes e takes d4 and black just plays knight takes d4, and you can never push the d pawn here, and you're stuck with this backwards pawn. So this is not really fun to play for white. White needs to play pretty energetically against these kind of moves. And the same thing goes for this. Although in this case, at least with this, there's no hole here on d4. It's not a hole, and you probably can play like a Benoni, and it's just transposed to Benoni. Against moves such as this, what you've got to do is play kind of super aggressive. So against c5, I'm going to have to recommend this b4 move. And this reminds you of a Blumenfeld gambit, because it is a Blumenfeld gambit. And I mean, this is really super aggressive. I mean, you can't really play knight c6 because of b5 taking away the knight. And if you go, I don't even know where black goes actually, somewhere really awkward, and you go bishop b2, probably f takes e takes d4, I don't know, probably back or something. That's embarrassing. And this pawn is already under serious pressure, and if you have to take, I mean, this is what white wants, and he gets a huge center, late in development, and a very comfortable position. I mean, in this kind of position, if we kind of continue the line, I don't know, I mean, probably e6 instead, my bad. Bishop d3, bishop d7, castles. Who wouldn't like this position as white? Looks very nice to me. And probably knight d2, queen e2, probably put the rooks here and go for, an attack over here on the king side, not the knight d4, but, pushing the center, going for a complete attack and try to kill black in the opening. A lot of the time you'll come across people that play like some kind of substandard move such as knight c6, or perhaps knight f6, which is a transposition to a Blumenfeld decline. But I'm not such a big fan of this kind of move. I think a declining move, bishop b2, continuing letting the pawn being gambited is a good option against that kind of move. Against b4, black usually just takes here this pawn. I mean, and just grabs the pawn entirely, and he doesn't really have any good alternatives that are. I mean, he has bishop g4 at some point, but I mean, this isn't that critical, and black should probably just take in this kind of position and allow this structure, but at least he's getting a pawn in return for compensation. And if white plays it incorrectly, I mean, black can get serious, good chances to stabilize the position and hold on to his extra pawn right here. So white has to play extremely aggressively in this kind of opening. So he takes the center with d4, a nice move to control a lot of these squares. And notice that black has lost the 2 pawns over here to control these squares, and these squares I mean too. And black has to react kind of in a very solid setup that it's hard to break down in order to kind of counter white's setup. So usually he commits the knight to this square, kind of keeping his options open. Maybe he wants to play a g6 setup or an e6 setup, but I think white's setup is pretty consistent in any case. Usually just plays the bishop to d3, and I mean, regardless of e6 or g6, or maybe if a bishop move like that, I think white just plays the following moves without much effort in this kind of setup, reorganizing the pieces and castles. Yeah, I mean here, you can play h3 and have a good game for white. Often, if white takes this kind of approach, I think you're ready to play with knight takes f3. I mean, ready to play queen e2 and e4 and e5 and d5. And this kind of approach is pretty nice. This is really nice compensation for white in the center. I actually think that white is probably better in this kind of position, even with the pawn down. Probably not bishop g4. Normally you don't want to trade off your light squared bishop in this kind of position where the pawn, this square is a hole. So maybe later on black would like to try to take advantage of this square. So often in this kind of position, black plays b6 and bishop b7, trying to attack this pawn, just protect the square. And white just continues with his setup. And I mean, you can go g6 or e6. It doesn't really make a difference. g6 is probably the more solid option that I've come across. And it's harder to attack, but I think it's the same kind of ideas that are present in this kind of position. And I mean, this is just a really tough position. White already has all of his pieces developed, and I mean, I've come across a few setups that I've found a little bit interesting, but nothing that great for black. I mean, it's really hard to counter this kind of position. I mean, one thing I've come across in over the board play and even online is maybe e6 followed by knight c6, or perhaps knight c6 first, followed by a future e5, trying to get his pawn in the center. And okay, you can play d5 here, but I mean, for the purpose of this purpose for ideas, I'm just going to continue this kind of setup where black has to commit really quickly. And I mean, it's really tough. Black wants to play e5, so I mean, let's say I don't know, a wasteful move or something with this kind of stuff, and I don't know, one more wasting with e4, and you have this nice, really pawn center, you know what I mean? A nice pawn center here, and then black plays e5, trying to throw a monkey in the wrench, if that's a wrench in the monkey. I don't know the phrase, but and this kind of structure might result with with the bishop on c5, allowing the knight to jump to d4. And in my opinion, I think probably bishop takes is better. And I mean, you have the dead bishops here, and you're just ready to break through in this kind of position. Not this specific position, but just an idea. After this e4 idea, black plays e5, and you push d5, and he gives a check here, or some kind of piece to c5, and you have a good strong center. And I mean, this is just a really, really nice position, and black just is struggling. That's pretty much for c5, really. I mean, there's other moves such as b6, but I'm not a big fan of this, such as with bishop b2. And black, might as well grab the pawn at some point, but we kind of transpose to that other line. But b6 isn't necessarily helpful in some setups, and if black doesn't know what to do, I mean, he can get blown off the board really quickly with we've kind of seen like this really massive kingside attack over here. Another move instead of c5 is knight c6, putting a piece in the center, trying to protect his pawn, and trying to gain some stability in the position. Ironically, though, white can play b4 anyway, and you might wonder, isn't this a free pawn after takes, and takes? Well, I guess you would be right. It is a free pawn, but it's not the greatest position in the world, if you ask me. Usually, and by the way, black can play kind of an interesting sideline here with bishop f5, and I think in this position, black can also play bishop e4, if I recall correctly. This is not so clear, but for the purposes of the ideas in this kind of position, most of the time, black will just take here and take this pawn. Seems fair enough. And in this kind of position, you kind of continue very, very normally with d4, putting a pawn in the center. And black has a few setups that he can try, but one interesting one that you might come across is, okay, just developing the knight first, right? Putting another piece in the center, but with a3, attacking this knight now, and then black playing some awkward move like that, but already this kind of position is very, very uncomfortable for black, since white's just getting a very quick development. And the kind of same setup as I showed you guys earlier with bishop b2, bishop d3, e4, castles, and maybe queen e2 to push e5 at some point. That's very, very nice for white. Usually in this position specifically, black has a few moves here, but this never really comes up in practice. But whenever I play against it, I always feel very, very comfortable in this position. And I guess in this specific position, against e5, this variation is pretty tricky on all levels, in my opinion. And ideally, what you want to do as white, I mean, you kind of want to keep on, let's say, building an initiative in this kind of position. So one thing you can do is start off with this a3 move, or perhaps you even want to start with bishop e2. It's all pretty normal. And with a3, okay, forcing the knight back here. And one idea is that d5 is met by e4 in this position. That's not that bad for black, actually. And generally speaking, you don't want to commit this pawn here so soon, I think. Black is about to play e4, and if you can't play d5, you might as well continue developing. So in this position, I've come across a couple moves that I like in this position, and one of them is bishop b2. And I think another one that Alexander Delchev recommended in his Reti Opening book was bishop e2. And I guess I can talk about some of the ideas in this kind of position. I mean, if black is playing, kind of passively, white just kind of builds this setup with bishop e2, and a move like e4, taking the knight here, going back here, and white can just castle, knight c3, and then queen e1, queen g3 maybe, and try to play off this nice center, the weak pawn on e4, and I think white's doing excellently here. Probably not knight f6 actually. Black probably wants to play e4 here, so he's already committed. He hasn't committed the knight here just yet. And white usually just plays to this square, attacking the pawn, preferring knight c3, and I mean, black can probably support it, and very, very unusual and quite crazy play can result. Very, very unorthodox kind of positions, really. I mean, this stuff is absolutely insane. I mean, you can definitely consider, maybe not d5 so early, but rook c1, some queen a4 something, and maybe you can even go for, this kind of kingside attack. I haven't run across this specific structure, honestly. I mostly, I think Delchev recommended in his book bishop e2 first, with this idea of e4, knight d2, and already f5 protecting the pawn, bishop b2, putting one more piece towards the center. And he recommended this queen g5 line, which is quite insane with this kind of these crazy complications that I just wouldn't recommend to play with some of your sanity intact. And I have a kind of an independent line from him, but the ideas are very similar. Yeah, but I mean, other than that, I mean, black doesn't have to play e5, obviously, but we kind of get this idea of this dual pawn center with very, very nice supported pieces, as you have seen in those kind of lines. More so, I come across a move like e6, and then usually this kind of position happens, and I mean, this is quite okay. I think also c5 also makes a lot of sense, and knight a6 to prevent running into this d5 move. And I think white just continues developing pretty normal. Maybe not g6. Sorry about that. Knight f6, bishop d3, g6, castles, bishop g7, d5 and e4, knight bd2, queen e2. The same normal setup that we've seen before. This is very, very pleasant for white. Although, I mean, I wouldn't say black's doing badly. He's just got to make sure he neutralizes white's long-term piece activity on the king side and this very, very nice pawn center that white relies upon. But other than that, I mean, I hope you guys kind of get this feel that, white usually gets the center in this kind of position. And if black plays a move like bishop g4, these are really, really unusual lines that I suggest you guys investigate. I think actually this is one of the main lines. I'm trying to remember some of the theory, but this is kind of independent from the ideas that you come across in the Reti Advanced variation, where black might as well take here when he's kind of searching for kind of a defensive position, while white takes the initiative here with his strong center and good pieces. All right, guys, this is Infinite Flash here. I'm gonna be signing out now. Leave a comment below about what you found interesting, what you didn't find interesting, what you didn't like, that kind of stuff. That's pretty much for the d4 variation. But generally speaking, I consider it really risky to play as black if he does not know what he's doing after e3. And I highly doubt your opponents will know much theory. I mean, white has a lot of good ideas in this kind of position, so if you come across it, you should definitely be prepared to attack black. Alright guys, see you.